Southern rap history. He was a young man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, navigating the same streets that produced Boosie Badazz himself. Michael Loudon, known throughout those neighborhoods as Marlo Mike, grew up in the kind of environment where options felt narrow and danger felt constant. Baton Rouge in the mid-2000s was a city where poverty ran deep, where gang activity had established roots that were generational, and where the line between making it out and getting swallowed up was razor thin for young men coming up in certain parts of that city. There was no industry waiting to absorb them, no network of opportunity pulling them towards safer paths. What there was the block, and the people on the block, and the rules that governed life on that block. That was the world Marlo Mike came up in. He was not a rapper. He was not someone who ever sought the spotlight or wanted his name in any kind of public conversation. He was a street figure, someone who moved in the shadows of a world that was becoming very bright, very fast because of one man whose star was rising out of that same environment. Torrance Hatch, the artist the world would come to know as Boosie Badazz. Now here's where it gets real, fam. Because the relationship between Boosie and Marlo Mike, as prosecutors laid it out in court, was not a friendship in the traditional sense of the word. It was not two neighborhood guys just running together and watching each other's backs the way you see in 1,000 rap videos. According to the prosecution's case, the relationship between these two men was transactional in the most violent way imaginable. Prosecutors alleged that Boosie, by this point one of the biggest names coming out of Baton Rouge with a growing national profile and real money behind him, was paying Marlo Mike to handle situations that needed to be handled permanently. Let that land for a second. The allegation was not that Marlo Mike was just someone Boosie knew from the block. The allegation was that Marlo Mike was allegedly functioning as a paid hitman, that Boosie was allegedly the man with the money and the motive, and Marlo Mike was allegedly the man with the trigger. Prosecutors argued that across multiple incidents, this was the arrangement that existed between them. Not a partnership of equals, not a crew situation, not two friends who happened to be around when things went bad. A financial arrangement where one man allegedly gave the order, handed over the money, and another man allegedly went and made it happen. That is what prosecutors put in front of a Louisiana jury, and that is what made this case unlike almost anything the rap world had seen at that point in time. To understand why these allegations carry so much weight, you have to understand who Boosie was at this moment in time and what he represented to people who followed his music and his career. By the late 2000s, Boosie Badazz was not just a regional name that circulated through Louisiana and the surrounding states. He had built a catalog of music that was raw and deeply personal in a way that few artists in any era have managed to sustain across multiple projects. His mixtapes were circulating everywhere. His name was attached to real cultural momentum. He had the kind of following that was built not on radio play or marketing budgets, but on people genuinely connecting with what he was saying because it reflected lives they actually lived. His music was not the kind of music that kept the streets at a comfortable, profitable distance. It was the kind of music that documented the streets from the inside, with the kind of detail and emotional honesty that only comes from someone who was not just observing, but living what he was rapping about. So when prosecutors started building a case that alleged his street involvement went far beyond what he was putting into lyrics, the collision between his public persona and the allegations in those court documents created a shockwave that moved through the entire hip-hop world at a moment when everybody was paying attention. People were not just reading about a man facing serious charges. People were reading about the man whose music had been the soundtrack to their lives, and they were sitting with the very complicated question of what it means when the line between the art and the life collapses completely. The specific case that became the centerpiece of the prosecution's theory involved the 2009 killing of a man named Terry Boyd. According to prosecutors, this was not a random act of street violence, not a situation that escalated out of a dispute and ended in tragedy. This was an alleged murder for hire, deliberate and calculated, that prosecutors argued Boosie had orchestrated from a position of relative power and that Marlo Mike had gone out and carried out. This was the killing that prosecutors used to build the first-degree murder charge against Boosie, the charge that carried with it the possibility of the death penalty in the state of Louisiana. Think about what that means for a moment. We're not talking about a weapons charge or a drug charge or even a manslaughter allegation. We are talking about the state of Louisiana looking Torrance Hatch in the eye and saying they were prepared to pursue execution. And Marlo Mike was the linchpin of the entire thing because he was the person prosecutors alleged had physically committed the act that formed the foundation of the most serious charge Boosie would ever face in his life. The courtroom timeline stretched across years. Boosie was indicted. He sat in prison while his case moved through the system. And all the while, the music world watched and waited and argued in comment sections and barbershops and everywhere else. People talked about rap, trying to make sense of what was happening to one of the most compelling voices the South has produced. But here's where it gets interesting, because the 2012 first-degree murder trial did not end the way prosecutors had planned. After hearing all of the evidence, after sitting through the testimony and the arguments and the back and forth of a high-stakes criminal proceeding that carried the most severe consequences the legal system could impose, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict on the murder charge. Boosie walked out of that courtroom acquitted on the most serious count against him. That does not mean he walked out of that era without consequences. He had separate drug charges that kept him incarcerated until 2014, and the years he spent behind bars took a toll that you can hear in the music he made during and after that period and see in every interview he has done since coming home. But the murder charge, the one that had the whole culture holding its breath, the one that could have taken him away forever, ended in an acquittal. That is the documented legal outcome, and no amount of internet commentary changes what that jury decided after hearing what was presented in that courtroom. Marlo Mike's story, however, ended very differently. While Boosie's jury returned a not guilty verdict, Michael Loudon faced his own reckoning in those same courts. And when that reckoning came, it came hard. He was convicted in connection with the killing of Terry Boyd, and the sentence handed down was life without the possibility of parole. Not a 10-year bid, not a 20-year stretch with the possibility of early release for good behavior. Life without parole. In Louisiana, that means exactly what it sounds like. You are going to prison, and the state does not intend for you to ever come back out. No projected release date. No parole board to petition after a certain number of years. The door closes, and it is designed to stay closed. That verdict and that sentence became part of the permanent legal record of what happened during that chapter of Baton Rouge's history. And for a while, for a few years at least, it seemed like that was going to be the end of the public conversation around this story. Marlo Mike was inside with a life sentence. The case was closed. The verdict was in on both sides of it. Boosie was out by 2014, rebuilding his life and his career, and the story started to feel like history rather than something still unfolding. But here's where it gets real spicy, because history has a way of refusing to stay in the past when the right person decides to pick it back up and bring it back into the present. And the person who did exactly that, the person who took a story that many people had filed away as settled and started making enough noise about it to pull a whole new generation into the conversation, was a man out of Fort Worth, Texas, named Charleston White. Now, if you know Charleston White, you already know he operates at a volume that most people are not prepared for. He is not a rapper, not a journalist, not a lawyer, not an academic. What he is someone who built one of the most unusual and polarizing platforms in internet culture by being willing to say out loud, on camera, things that most people either keep private or frame very carefully before sharing publicly. He has talked openly about his own past, his criminal history, the time he spent incarcerated as a young man, the way those experiences shaped his perspective on street culture, on the rap industry, and on the relationship between the two. That personal history is central to how he presents himself and why a segment of the audience takes what he says seriously. He is not coming at these topics from a distance. He is coming at them as someone who says he has lived inside the same world he is now critiquing from the outside. Charleston White has gone at Boosie publicly and repeatedly over the years, and his commentary has not been subtle or measured or designed to leave room for interpretation. He has challenged Boosie's street credibility directly, questioned the narrative around what happened during those cases in specific terms, and made arguments that the public conversation around Boosie's acquittal does not capture the full picture of what he believes went down during those years in Baton Rouge. Now, whether his beliefs are accurate, whether they are based on information that goes beyond what the public record shows, or whether they are the conclusions of someone processing old stories through a very specific personal lens, those are questions that do not have clean answers. What is not a question is that his commentary generated reaction every single time it dropped. Boosie responded publicly on multiple occasions. Fans took sides, clips got shared across every platform, and with every round of that cycle, the story got another injection of energy that kept it moving through the algorithm and into conversations that had nothing to do with the original 2009 events. But here is the specific angle that has people talking right now, the part that goes beyond the general back and forth between these two figures and touches directly on why Marlo Mike's name is suddenly back in the center of the conversation. Charleston White has been vocal about Marlo Mike specifically, and what he has been saying is not just about relitigating the past. What he has been pushing publicly is the idea of fighting for Marlo Mike's freedom. He has made statements about wanting to see Marlo Mike come home. He has raised the question of whether the conviction was just and whether anything can or should be done about it. He positioned himself as someone who is not willing to accept that a life sentence handed down years ago is necessarily the final word on what happens to Michael Loudon. And when you sit with what that actually means, when you think through the implications of a loud and visible public figure with a significant audience taking up that specific cause, you start to understand immediately why this development would land with such force among people who were connected to those original events. Think about what it would mean if that campaign ever gained real traction. Think about what it would mean if Marlo Mike's case were ever revisited in a serious legal context. If an appeal found purchase somewhere in the Louisiana court system, if some argument that had not been made before found the right judge at the right moment, if the sentence that was supposed to be the permanent end of the story turned out not to be permanent after all. A man walking out of prison after serving a life sentence is not just a man going home. He is a man with a complete and detailed account of everything he experienced, everything he allegedly did, everything he allegedly was instructed to do and by. He is a man who, if he chose to tell that story publicly, could do so in a media environment that would make sure every word reached every corner of the internet within hours. Podcasts, live streams, documentaries, tell-all interviews, and the infrastructure for that kind of revelation exists at a scale it never did when these events first occurred. And that reality, the reality of what a freed Marlo Mike could potentially say in a world full of cameras and platforms and audiences hungry for exactly this kind of story, is the thing that changes the entire emotional weight of the situation for anyone whose name might come up in that telling. That is the dynamic underneath the panic narrative. Not a physical confrontation, not a street beef playing out in the present. The stakes being discussed in those comment sections, the stakes that have people saying Boosie is shook, are informational stakes. They are the stakes of a man who knows things, who allegedly did things and allegedly knew who ordered them, potentially walking into a world where telling that story would be the most valuable thing he could offer and where platforms would line up to give him the space to tell it. That is a different kind of threat than anything the streets send your way, because there is no way to prepare for it, no way to manage it in advance, and no way to control the outcome once it starts moving. For Boosie, the years since his 2014 release have been a complex and very public journey that has played out across interviews, social media, music releases, and a string of controversies that have kept him in conversations that had nothing to do with his legal history. He came home to a fan base that had genuinely held him down while he was inside. People who kept his name alive, who played his music, who showed up for him in a way that fans show up for artists they feel a real connection to. He released music, he rebuilt his profile, he found himself at the center of debates and controversies that spanned everything from parenting to health to his opinions on topics well outside the lane of his music. He became one of the most interviewed and most argued about figures in Southern hip-hop, not just because of his past, but because of who he continues to be publicly. Candid, unfiltered, willing to say things that generate strong reactions from people on every side of any given conversation. That version of Boosie, the post-incarceration public figure who seems almost allergic to staying quiet, is the version most of his current audience knows best. But the shadow of the 2009 to 2012 period never fully disappears, no matter how many new conversations get started on top of it. That shadow is structural. It is part of the foundation of his public biography in a way that nothing he does going forward can fully displace. Charleston White understood that when he chose Marlo Mike as a focal point, because attaching the Marlo Mike narrative to a public campaign, even a campaign whose legal prospects are unclear, even a campaign that may never produce actual courtroom results, guaranteed that Boosie's name would stay locked to the most sensitive chapter of his past in the minds of every new audience that discovered the story. Every video about freeing Marlo Mike is also inescapably a video that reminds people of everything that was alleged about Boosie during those years. Every discussion of the conviction is also a discussion of the acquittal and of what the prosecution argued about who gave the alleged orders. The two stories cannot be separated because the prosecution linked them in a courtroom, and Charleston White has made sure that Link stays visible in the public conversation years after the courtroom proceedings ended. What this story ultimately reflects, when you zoom all the way out and look at it from a distance, is something bigger than any one person's biography or any one case's legal outcome. It reflects the way that street life in the music industry.
Man, let me know what y'all think, man. Let's see that boy Marlo might getting out of jail. They say bullshit shit. Let me know what y'all think, man. Drop your comments and we'll get back to y'all, man. It's your boy out there on 24. All just playing Big L, man. Let's look it up. Let's go.